Yeah, thanks very much. It's an honour to be with you. Glad the technology appears to be working. Until now, I'll check my screen. Sorry, I can't talk without a PowerPoint presentation being there. Right, okay, so at this point I can't see questions, so if anybody has an interruption or technology interference, perhaps somebody could shout up and just tell me, because I can just see my screen now. So it's an honour to be with you. I am a police officer by career. I spent 30 years as a police officer, but I got seconded, and the relevance to perhaps what we're going to talk about today, I got seconded to run the government's hate crime programme in 2007. I'll explain how it came about, but basically there was a view taken that there needed to be a single holistic response to hate crime, that the police weren't going to solve this on their own. It wasn't going to be done by criminal justice agencies. Some of the interventions and some of the hostilities and some of the underlying causes of hate needed civil society to be involved. They needed communities to be involved, and they needed every part of government, from foreign policy through to health policy. And I was brought in, not necessarily to direct all of them, because ministers still maintain their obviously ministerial independence. I was brought in to be the choreographer, to make sure everybody was dancing in step. So for 14 years I run that. I've now stepped back into advising the police. So, but I've overseen some of the developments I'm going to talk about as we go through. My experience internationally on hate crime is hate crime has come around more often than not because of a tragedy, or because of a failing of state in some significant way. And the tragedy that most impacted on policing in my 30-year career in the UK was the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. I would, if I had more time to talk about policing culture, I would say that I joined a police force. I joined in the middle of the miners' strike in the 80s, where Thatcher's government was seeking to effectively destroy the power base of the unions, and the police were seen as the pawns in on the board, and we were seen as a force, and I was trained to be in charge and trained to be controlling of the society that I policed. And I left a police service and very much a culture of being there to serve the police, serve the public and not control the public. And a lot of that came around because of the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence. It wasn't a high-profile murder in 1993 when Stephen was murdered, but it became high-profile because of the exposure of the failings of the police, because the police had preconceived ideas that because of where Stephen was and when he was out in the evening, that it was probably a gang-related, probably drugs-related crime. And it was a number of opportunities were missed, and the family were treated badly. They were treated as suspects rather than as victims. And the exposure didn't happen anytime soon. We had a Conservative government at the time, and they resisted attempts to have an inquiry into Stephen's murder and the failings of the police. But when the administration changed in 1997, after people like Nelson Mandela had intervened and exposed the concerns in the community, a public inquiry was held, and it really did change so much of what follows for us. And I would argue that it puts the UK probably a generation ahead of most comparable states around the world. And that's not to say that we're better. And I genuinely don't stand here to say I'm better, and I'm going to expose how badly we get it wrong on occasions. But it made us focus sooner. We'd had the race riots, or the race-based riots, in the 1980s, where our multicultural society, which was multicultural because of our history, because of colonialization, because of people having the rights to be here, because of the need for people to come in and help rebuild the UK after the war. There was a number of reasons, but we failed earlier than most, and that's probably why we're so far ahead of some in many respects now, I would argue. Okay, so why do we deal with hate crime, and why is it important? for us, it's one of the legacies of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. The recognition that most victims didn't come to the police, didn't tell the police had got a hostile relationship with people who should be on our side, with civil society, with academia, with kind of partners who should be allies. The importance of increasing reporting was one of the significant factors of that. And the relationship with the victims, with families, with civil society were a key message. So for me, one of the broader issues, hate crime is the cause or the symptom of pretty much every global conflict in history. If it isn't a cause of the conflict, it's usually there afterwards. And hate crime can be a precursor, it can be a barometer, it can give us the best indication of the society and the disruption that occurs within society. It is the foothills of terrorism. By definition, a terrorist crime is a hate crime, in my view. There is no overlapping circles. Terrorism is a smaller circle within a bigger circle, in my view. And what we have to do is to understand the tensions and the fears. And terrorism is doubly important. Hate crime is doubly important in terms of terrorism prevention, because not only are the emotions that bring around division and hate usually expressed at a lower level before terrorist crime, but also those who are disaffected, those who feel outside society, who are targeted and told they're not welcome in society, are significantly more susceptible to being radicalized if they believe they're in a society that hates them. So it's a double connection as far as I'm concerned. We know that early interventions can prevent tragedies. That's largely because when we look back at tragedies retrospectively, we can see places that had we understood, had we known, had we effectively been able to interpret hate speech and hate crime, we could have put in place interventions to prevent the tragedy. So we know that early intervention is a key part of our strategy. I believe it's a foundation of a moral democracy. The way a state protects its minority citizens is, for me, one of the best indicators of a moral, thriving democracy. And we also have international commitments. Now, we have more international commitments in the north, in the global north, than the south. But we all have at least one commitment. So we have an organisation called the OSCE, the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe. We have the Council of Europe. We have we used to have before we decided to leave through the back door, the EU and commitments that are kind of maintained there. But most of them, is by definition, are in the Northern Hemisphere. The biggest is the OSCE with 57 member states, which is everywhere from Kazakhstan through to Canada. But we also have now a commitment under the Kyoto Conference, the Kyoto Declaration that was passed in March this year. At the UN Office for Drugs and Crime was the first time that the UN has included a commitment to respond to hate crime. And I've copied it there. It's a I can't tell you how much work went into this. And when you read it, as you can read for yourself rather than me read it to you, Action 91 of the Kyoto Declaration, which was passed and adopted at the Congress, gives there a commitment to deal with hate crime. And whilst it's not detailed, whilst it's not as robust as maybe the first draft started out that the UK and allies had proposed to the Congress, it is for me vitally important, because certainly for the global south, it is the first time, to my understanding, that there is a universal commitment to deal with hate crime and respond to hate crime. How that's interpreted is really in its very early days. We've been having meetings with the officials who lead for the UN ODC in Vienna about what that might mean. But just to give you a sample of what it could mean, is in the OSCE, which had a similar commitment back in 2009, placed on it, what that meant is they set up an organisation called ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and they monitor hate crime from the participating states. So participating states report data in, They offer support and training, capacity building, community facilitation building. So we're hoping to see something similar as a capacity out of UNODC, but there is that commitment. So moving on, in terms of the UK, I'm not going to dwell on these at all because they're not overly important to you, but we have certain hate crime legislation. So we don't have hate crime offences, but what we have is built around aggravating offences. So if somebody assaults somebody and they demonstrate hostility based on one of the protected characteristics, which for us is race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender at the moment, then the sentence, the court are instructed under section 145 and 146 of the Criminal Justice Act to enhance the sentence and declare why they've done so in court. We also have some specific offences like, for instance, racist chanting in football stadia, and also incitement offences, so incitement to hatred offences, which are the ones that are perhaps the most contentious, but they're very rarely used. We prosecute around about between 5 and 10 incitement offences per year in the UK, so they're not commonly used, and they're reserved for those who are trying to create a race war, effectively trying to stir up hatred to bring around violence to affected communities. So here is a kind of data that I've extracted just to give a kind of a guide as to hate crime reporting. I would say from the offset, and I will say from the offset that I don't believe that the UK is more racist than America, for instance, or the Russian Federation. So, but for me, one of the issues about a state's response is, have citizens got the confidence to turn to the state or turn to somebody who has got an intermediary relationship with the state to tell them about what's happened and to expect a service? So we see high numbers as a measure of confidence, a measure of advancement, a measure of progress, rather than a kind of indicator of greater hostility. But when you look at those data on the screen from 2019, which is the latest data that the OSC submitted, and there's a link there which will take you to all of the 57 states, or at least those who submit the data. You'll see that there is it's almost impossible to make a relative assessment based on that data. If you look at Austria and the UK, I mean, it just is incomparable. We have similar demographics and population size and challenges to Italy, and we record 100 times more crimes for a similar population. We record 50 or 60 times more crimes than the US when you look at data population. And the police in the Met in London, who are amongst our most beleaguered colleagues in the UK now and sort of generally, they have progressed to the point where they record more hate crime than America does. And if you think there is more hate crime in London than there is in America, then you've been to a different America than me. So in terms of progress, I would see that as a significant indicator of progress when you compare those states. When you look at the UK, it starts to go downhill to some degree, and so what I've introduced there is the data from a crime survey as well. So in the England and Wales, we recorded 105,000 crimes, excluding Greater Manchester Police, my local force, who couldn't provide the data. They had a new IT system and it went horribly wrong, and they couldn't provide the data, so that's missing. But what we'll see there from in the figure below is that the crime survey estimated 190,000. So we have one of the first things I oversaw, the first piece of work I oversaw when I came in 2007 was to agree a common definition. And as was said in the introduction, obviously, if we aren't working to common definitions, our data becomes meaningless by way of comparison. So we introduced a common definition as virtually my first role in the post in 2007. And then we started to put questions into the National Crime Survey, which is a household survey that goes and knocks on 45,000 households a year and asks questions about their exposure to crime in general. So we added hate crime data in there. So we've had this data fairly robust since 2009. So the data tells us that there's 190,000 crimes that actually took place. Then they're not directly comparable for academic reasons. You've got to understand the difference. That, for instance, the crime survey only includes people over 16 who live in residential settings. So it wouldn't include a crime against a 14-year-old child. It wouldn't include a crime against a tourist, but they would be included in our crime data. So they're not directly comparable. The methodology is the same, it's been consistent. So to see the comparison of gaps between the two is a consistent measurement, and I'll show you how we've done on that. So you can also see there that when you look at the breakdown, about 80% of our recorded hate crime is race-based, and you'll see the others, but you'll also see that race is significantly more likely to come to the attention and be recorded by the police than if you look at transgender and disability. You'll see that they are significantly less likely. You'll also see that there was actually 4,000 when you kind of differentiate between the total number of crimes and the total number of hostilities, that there was just over 4,700 or around 4,700 that had more than one hostility. So that issue about multiple factor hostility is a real kind of issue that we perhaps need to understand better. So in terms of the red column here is, so this is 2009 through to 2018. You'll see that the red column is the crime survey. So we have seen 10 years of reduction of physical hate crime seen by our citizens. So we've gone from 307,000 to 272 to 222 and 184, and then latterly it was 190. And at the same time, the blue line is the recorded crime, which goes from kind of about 43,000 up to 105,000 that you've seen now. So what that effectively is telling us that on the comparison between the two sets of data, we've gone from about 1 in 6 hate crimes to about 1 in 2 being recorded by the police. And given that the objective that we set ourselves in 2007 was to close the gap of underreporting, the so-called dark figure of underreported hate crimes, we've made phenomenal success there, and that comes around because of relationships with civil society, because of victims having more confidence to come forward, because of things like True Vision, which is a kind of web resource that we host by the police that gives people the ability to report online and even report anonymously should they choose to do so. So we see that that's about where the good news finishes. I'll stop gloating now and sort of give you the bad news, because what the survey also tells us is that we're weak in many respects in terms of performance. So it tells us that victims are more likely to be repeat victims when they're a victim of hate crime. So you can see there that 27% of when it breaks it down to different categories. So household crime, 27% of victims of hate crime victims are repeats, as in that they've been subject to a similar crime in the previous 12 months, whereas only 20% of victims in general for that. You see there that there are lower satisfaction levels. 55% of hate crime victims, despite every chief officer saying that this is a priority crime, only 55% were satisfied with the police response compared to 66% of victims in general. And really worryingly, only 70% said they were treated fairly and 84% with respect, compared to 90 and 79% for crime victims in general. That really is kind of difficult for us to accept or to kind of hear, because we would all say it's a priority, and every chief officer would say that. So what we know is that there is one of three things I would suggest. Either victims' expectation levels are unrealistic about what they can expect from the police. Secondly, that the police who go out on the streets don't share the same commitment as the senior officers. Or thirdly, and I think this is probably a factor in the victims who come from minority communities who have perhaps a disrespect for the police, who perhaps have a fear of the police, perhaps have a lack of trust in the police, are probably more likely to see the things that we would see as incompetence, like getting there less quickly as the victim would want, or keeping people updated with what goes on once they've made a report. then clearly that's likely to be seen as discrimination rather than incompetence. But either way, it's a huge challenge for us to build that confidence. And we know that the data also tells us, and this is really important as why hate crime for me has to be a priority for every thriving society. The victims who are emotionally affected, 96% of hate crime victims are emotionally affected compared to 83% for crime in general. But when you look at the more serious harm, like panic and anxiety attacks, victims are 3 times more likely to suffer those more serious psychological harm when they're a victim of hate crime. When you look at that crime on the picture, you can really understand why that's the case. So we can see that that is a criminal damage, probably in most jurisdictions, that would be criminal damage. And it probably is maybe $300-400 worth of damage, I guess. But the message that is there is one that you are not safe in your home, that you're not welcome, that you're not accepted in society. And clearly the emotional harm of that attack is significantly more troubling than the physical crime. So for me, it kind of is a justification again. I wanted to just highlight what can be done on an international scale and what commitments what a difference commitments can make. And I'm going to compare the two of the Georgias. I know there's more than 2, but 2 Georgias, the country in Eurasia and the state in the USA. So they kind of share a name and probably not much else. But Georgia, the state, is hugely important in hate crime as a policy area. It's most criminologists, I don't think criminologists all agree where the term originated from as a policy area. But I think the term hate crime, most people will see it's having its roots within the civil rights movements in the US. And Martin Luther King, who was kind of around the time of the civil rights movement, the talk of racism and the talk of hate crime really came to the fore there in terms of an adoption of a policy, which was then adopted across the Northern Hemisphere in various speeds. Georgia, the state, is obviously in a different part of the world, emerged out of the Soviet Union, has got a position where it's just, for anybody who isn't aware where Georgia is, it's kind of just above Turkey, just below Russia. The kind of was involved in a conflict with Russia in 2008 in the South Ossetia, where the Russian Federation invaded South Ossetia, and it's kind of near to Chechnya, and you'll kind of get the picture from there. But it's a hugely different country. So my screen works. So Georgia in the USA, as I say, is central to the history of the hate crime movement. It has got a population of 10.6 million, and despite the concentration on this as a policy area since the 60s, it only recorded 102 hate crimes in 2019 for the whole state. And given it's kind of almost where racism was invented, kind of in its modern form, for me that shows that there is no realistic recording of hate crime. If that for me doesn't reflect my experience of Georgia from what I've seen of it. Georgia, the country, has only had a hate crime focus since 2010. And it had a hate crime focus because of the allegation that Russian-speaking individuals were being targeted for abuse because of the South Ossetia crisis. So I went out there first with colleagues from international sort of colleagues from OSCE and the like, to try and help them to deal with this, because the government wanted to respond to hate crime. And then it had a really bad experience where it had an event called or an organisation called Identober arranged a pride march through Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, in 2012, and the police horrifically stood by and allowed the march to be attacked by individuals from the society, and they just stood by and watched people get seriously hurt. And they were taken to the European Court of Human Rights, and under the European Human Rights Framework, the state has a duty to protect people from abuse like this, and they sued the government, and Georgia were found guilty of failing to protect their rights, and have put in place a significant amount of work supported by those international bodies, but also kind of supported by a number of countries like ourselves bilaterally. And they've gone from the point where, with a third of the population of Georgia, the state have gone up to the point where they're recording 775 hate crimes. We've assisted them internationally with things like training the police, training prosecutors. We've had lots of study visits to countries like the UK from senior prosecutors, and they've brought in around a significant advancement in a really short period of time, because there was a focus and because there was a demand and because there was a will to do so. I'm going to briefly go through and talk about some of the challenges with hate crime that we faced during the COVID pandemic. And what we see here is a screenshot from our True Vision website. It's there, and it's there for anybody to see, but it's a resource that is invaluable to us. It's had well over 2 million visits since it was posted in 2011. It receives around about 7,000 reports a year through its reporting portal. And you can see there's a big sort of reporting button on every page, and it really has proved invaluable. Its cost is so minimal. It costs around about £300 a year to host. It cost us about maybe 15,000 in truth to set it up with the secure reporting portal. But it really has been invaluable to us as a public face of policing in response to hate crime. So we've had significant challenges through COVID, and I'm just going to show you how kind of some of these played out. We've had challenges here with a kind of a rupture in the community since the referendum on membership of Europe in 2016, and then we had terrorist attacks in 2017, and we've had a number of incidents, one of which I'm going to show you as a case study, that have really challenged us. So we've kind of built on that, and those kind of hostilities really have played out in a different way. So one of the issues that came out of the pandemic was the abuse of people who have Chinese heritage or Chinese and Southeast Asian heritage. So for us, what we classify as IC5, which is our ethnic categories that would include China and Southeast Asia, they would not necessarily be high profile or highly targeted from our racist groups or from our racist kind of ideologues. And they account for normally around about 1 or 2% of our hate crime victims in the UK. But when we found a link to COVID, there was times when, for instance, the President of the United States was making racist comments about China, about blaming China for the virus. Those crimes went up between 12 and 20% some weeks of the hate crime where we could find a link to COVID were against IC5 victims. So we know that world events and world speakers and world voices can play out on what we have, and we have old historical hostilities between the English and the Welsh, with racist graffiti and kind of attacks on English people in Wales and Welsh people in and around Wales. We kind of have all seen, and I won't dwell on, but you'll all have seen the QAnon conspiracies and the issues that were playing out there. And we were massively impacted, and I'll show you kind of how we were impacted by the Black Lives Matter, by the tragic murder of George Floyd, by the taking to the streets of not only Black citizens here, but a huge number of white, particularly middle class white, sort of young people in particular, who were taken to the streets in solidarity with Black people. And we had a situation here where this is the moment where a kind of statue of a bloke called sorry, my Siri decided to assist then, so I didn't really need that. So, but we had a statue of a bloke called Eric Colston, who was a slave trader who donated lots of money in his kind of latter years towards good causes in Bristol, but the money was ill-gotten. It came from slavery, but he had statues up, and effectively in the Black Lives Matter, the statue was pulled down and thrown into the harbour, as you can see just before he plunges into the harbour. And whilst there was very few hate crimes caused by that, the backlash towards that from the far right was quite significant. So we have here a screenshot of one of our analytical sort of products, which is effectively our daily hate crime data. And this, for me, shows the value of that data, as well as obviously the victims and the care for the victims. It helps us so much to understand what impacts on our society and what impacts on hate crime, and informs our efforts to reduce hate crime. So here we have, and the sort of the addresses there, if anybody wants to look at it. There is a lot of caveats on this because we take the data in a kind of very soon after the event, so it isn't complete data. But what we've got here is a timeline of all the events that played out. We've got our kind of COVID lockdowns, we've got things like the George Floyd events, and you can kind of see that in our lockdown, which was sort of from March through to June in our first lockdown, we saw a significant drop in hate crime initially. But that was because nightclubs and pubs were kind of not open, so we saw a 20% drop. But by the end of the lockdown, we were well above average. And after the George Floyd attack happened, we saw on the day that the far right attacked the police in London, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw a rise in hate crime from an average of 274 for that year to 469. So the impact of that was huge on the physical crimes, and they weren't during those protests. Those were crimes inspired by their actions. And I'll come back to that. Here is sort of that in a slightly more detail, and then here is another one where we see the yellow line is religious hate crime. So the average number of religious hate crimes we get is 19 per day for the year, for what is actually over 18 months. The average is 19. But you can see that when the conflict happened in Israel and Gaza and sort of areas like that, the number of religious hate crimes went up to 47. Now, they were largely an increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hostility, but our media portrayed the conflict that was happening in Israel as Islam versus Judaism, and very much it was kind of portrayed in that conflict. Whereas anybody who's been to Jerusalem will know that there is a multitude of different religious groups with different ethnicities, all living within a kind of 1 mile square in the old city. And the issue of the conflict is significantly more broad than it is Judaism versus Islam. But you can see that the conflict plays out significantly. One of the biggest spikes that we've encountered with this was after the horrific Christchurch attacks in 2019. And what we saw, we monitor anti-Semitism or we monitor all hate crime, but we saw an increase in anti-Semitism after the Paris supermarket attack, where the only role of Jews was as murder victims in the supermarket. And we saw a rise in anti-Semitism, but when we analysed it with our civil society partners, we found that it was more likely to be down to greater fear and alertness and more police presence in around the Sabbath and around our holidays than it was about hostility towards. We saw similar with the LGBT community after the Pulse nightclub attack, where we saw an increase, but we think it was probably more about greater policing presence and more people being more fearful. But what we saw after Christchurch was well over a 200% increase in anti-Muslim hostility, anti-Muslim hate crime in the following week. Now, that was significantly over and above that. And what that tells us is, in the same way as the Australian perpetrator of that atrocity in New Zealand was covered his weapons with mentions of crimes that took place in Norway and in the UK, the internationalization of this is hugely important to us. But it also tells us that the warped minds of the people who would attack innocent individuals means that in that instance, they were more likely to be motivated by empathy with a perpetrator, who clearly they didn't know, than they were by even kind of an Islamist crime where the perpetrator is from that community. So kind of understanding this data and having this data as robust as we can gives us the best chance of understanding our communities. Where we get to hate crime, I believe that the police data has to be the most robust. It has to be the best barometer we can get. It isn't necessarily as quick to get as civil society data, but it is the most comprehensive. My view is that we will never get to the point where recording of hate crime offences when they take place online, or hate speech offences, recording of reports from the public will ever be an indicator of the level of the hostility. And for me, we have to understand these in a different way. We have to respond in a different way. And we have to be measuring using academia and using civil society partner and using kind of technical solutions, rather than relying on the data of people telling us about it. So for me, it's very simple. I appreciate there's people sort of significantly more knowledgeable about social psychology than me, but the one model I kind of frame our response around is Gordon Allport's scale of discrimination, which I think is the one that everybody around the world uses to discuss these issues. But his argument and my belief is that there is a relationship between these, and it may not always be that everybody who uses hate speech will go on to kill. But the reality of it is everybody who kills will have been exposed to, motivated by, or used hate speech along the way. So for me, for the state, this is a continuum where the state has to have an understanding of each level and a response to each level. And whilst the top two may be about criminal justice and the middle one may be about civil enforcement, the bottom is just as important, and it's really important that we understand those levels of hostility being demonstrated and contained within our communities, and that we seek to respond to them. But clearly we're not going to respond to all hate speech or all hostility or all avoidance through enforcement. It has to be through education, it has to be through leadership, it has to be through setting standards to bring communities together. So I kind of, I'm just checking how we're doing for time. I kind of, sorry, sorry, I'll tell you what he said. This is Adama Dieng. It's only 1.5 minutes long. I just wanted to play this because Adama Dieng he's just stood down, but he was the UN rapporteur on genocide prevention, a really impressive man. I kind of had the pleasure to meet him, to listen to. And he talks about the relationship between hate speech, and this work that he was, the talk he does now, was at the launch of a UN action plan on hate speech, which is recognising its integral role to prevention of hate crime and prevention of genocide, amongst others. So I'll just play this. If the sound doesn't come through, can somebody shout me? Because I think I've ticked to say it should. So hopefully this will work. It's only about 1.5 minutes long.
We all have to remember that hate crimes is preceded by hate speech. We all have to remember that the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda started with hate speech. The Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. It started long before with hate speech. What we have been seeing in Myanmar against the Rohingya population started also with hate speech. And today, what we are witnessing around this world, with the rise of extremists, be it in Europe, be it in Asia, everywhere, when we see the growing number of neo-Nazi group, neo-fascist group, when we see the way migrants and refugees are being vilified, we need therefore to make every effort to address this hate speech. We have to bear in mind that words kill. Words kill as bullets. And that is why we need to make every effort to invest on education, to invest on the youth, so that the next generation will understand the importance of living peacefully together. We need to make every effort so that the attacks like the one we have witnessed in Sri Lanka, when churches were attacked, the one we witnessed in New Zealand, what we saw in Pittsburgh, all this has to stop. And to stop it, we need to invest more on mobilizing the youth. We need to use the verb to become a tool for peace, a tool for love, a tool for increasing social cohesion, harmony in our world, instead of being a tool for committing genocide, crimes against humanity.
Okay, so I need to be back with you. Measuring hate speech is really important. What I try to do is to, or what we try to do is to measure harm. And for me, the most important message, if I was a kind of academic with time to think about these things, I would doubtless come up with some fancy formula that kind of considered all of those. So the consideration of the speaker, the reach, the platform, the audience, how vociferous was the speech, and the level of influence they have. But I would say that the most vociferous is not necessarily the most harmful. Somebody with 2 million followers in a daily newspaper who does a drip, drip, drip demonization of Muslims, or as migrants, or as gay people, or as trans people, is much more likely to cause harm to society than a rabid neo-Nazi with 6 followers who are also rabid neo-Nazis. There is a motivational relationship between extremists who share their vile, but the reality is the community are less affected by that. And I know one of our few things that we export is hate, and I know that Katie Hopkins has been living with you for a while, but I'm told she's on her way back. Katie Hopkins has, when she posted this material, which followed a weekend where 3 young men died in London in different violent attacks, and clearly everybody has a responsibility to be concerned about violence against young people in our city centres. But what she was doing is using it as part of a campaign against the London mayor, who's a Muslim man, and she's using racist diatribes, she's using racist language, she's talking about Londonistan, which is this kind of childish kind of name that kind of is the far right used to describe London, because they say it's turned into kind of Afghanistan, and so she promotes this, and my recollection is that at the time she posted this, I think she had 800,000 followers on Twitter. She's had a Twitter account removed now, but I think at the time she had about 800,000 followers. What then happened is kind of this happened, in that her message was retweeted by the President of the United States, who dives on to, he'd had a bit of a spat with Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, and had been saying kind of all sorts of bad things about him, but he, with his 84 million followers, retweets it. So my recollection is that Katie Hopkins went from 800,000 to 1.1 million followers around about this time, because obviously she was now exposed by somebody with significantly more followers and significantly more influence. So the kind of the speech of that was significantly likely to be more harmful. But the folly of it is that it's so unfair that here is a comparison of the homicides per 100,000 population in 2017 and 2018, by comparison between London at 1.5 homicides per 100,000 people, through to New York at 3.3 and Baltimore at 55.7. So the President of the United States that's overseeing the violence in Baltimore and Detroit and New Orleans is picking on a mayor for whatever reason he chose to pick on him, but obviously exacerbating the hostility and the tension and the impact on the communities in the UK. So for me, one of the important things about this is about civil society, and obviously that's part of what you kind of are considering through the conference. And for me, civil society are really important actors. There are always going to be people, particularly in minority communities, who don't trust the police, who don't have the confidence to go to the police, who maybe immigration status means that they're fearful of going to the police. And providing them with another route is a vital part of our response. And I would suggest it's a vital tool for anybody taking this seriously. And finding out who those allies are is a really important challenge. And one of our independent advice group, we have a group of experts and sort of academics, victims advocacies who come together to advise us on our policies. And one of them, John Grieve, who was the chair of the group, has a mantra which says that you can't build partnerships when the bullets are flying. You've got to build your partnerships in advance and deploy them when times get tough. We also kind of have to remember that real friends accept criticism, and we have to be prepared to accept the criticism when things aren't going well as obviously the plaudits when things are. We have to share ideals. There are groups who wanted to be partners with us in this work who were, for instance, from one sectarian religious group, and they were happy to demand the rights for their particular sectarian background, but would actually espouse hostility or condone hostility towards somebody from a different religious group or somebody who is gay. So we have a mantra which says that if you can condemn all hate crime, you're part of the solution. If you can only condemn some, you're part of the problem. We can't be partners with the problem. So we have formal data sharing agreements. These are available on the True Vision site. We publish them, they're transparently, and they provide national relationships which says, here is what we will exchange, here's what we'll tell you about, here's what you tell us about, this is how often we'll meet and how we share. And it's built around anonymous reporting, so that they will kind of report, kind of share data anonymously unless the victim explicitly says that they wish to have their information passed over. But it allows us to almost sit and say, right, we've got these 10 crimes this weekend, 3 at the bus station, 2 at the train station, have you got them? And they swap and they share and they kind of eventually pick up a bigger picture and a complete picture. And here's one example of it, that on the left-hand kind of infographic there, you'll see that in Greater Manchester in 2015, there was 402 anti-Muslim hate crimes, 359 were reported directly to Greater Manchester Police, and 43 were recorded first by Talmama and reported onto the police. So that kind of helps us to see that their slice of the pie might be smaller than ours, but actually not having that slice of the pie means that we're only seeing part of the picture. So I'll start to move on a bit. How that plays out in terms of community tension and community cohesion, we run a goal group, so we have a national response to which where we set up a goal group, and a goal group is like everybody deals with everything. It's like how we manage dangerous offenders, it's how we manage particular challenges. It's around the simplest of theories, is that you gather the people around who know what you need to know, you analyze your data, you assess the risk, and you then agree an action plan. It's really simple stuff. But having the right people around with the right relationships and the right skills is obviously important. So we have a goal group running that looks at national community tensions, looks at hate crime levels, looks at emerging threats. And this runs constantly, chaired by either myself or Mark Hamilton, my colleague there, who sort of would be chairing this meeting. And it brings together academics, it brings together civil society partners, and we all sit around the table and we all share information and we all agree an action plan, which I'm then kind of responsible for going and driving as we go through. And I just wanted to pick out one of those groups. So this is the kind of the Hate Lab, which is a partnership between ourselves as the police and Cardiff University, one of our universities in Wales. And it's funded by a thing called the English Social Research Council to develop tools to understand the impact of hate speech. So this is what this is, and academics will kind of know similar things. These are the first kind of batch of these really came out of kind of brand recognition. So companies wanted to know how many people knew about their cornflakes or whatever. And what the universities have done is developed it with the nuance through using machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to know the difference between. So this isn't just looking for the N word on Twitter. This is kind of looking for nuance. So it would know that a message that says, I've just been at the bus stop and called the N word, it would know that that wasn't a hate message because the nuance is different. So it can differentiate between. So this is one that kind of is about Brexit. So it's a kind of colloquialism for our kind of leaving of Europe. And this was a 2-day period where it was measuring on Twitter the number of hate messages that related to Brexit. So this is only finding those examples where there is a reference to Brexit and hate messages. And what it does is it gives us a timeline. You can kind of see here that there's a huge spike in day 2. So this is a kind of 24 hours where you see less in the evening, less in the night, and then more in the day and the evening. And you can see there's a huge spike. You can kind of see that there was 459,000 hate messages in a 2-day period about Brexit. There was around about 400 to 500 a day at its peak, and then here we go to 1,100. And that happened when our government prorogued Parliament, which is a word I'd never heard of, but it meant suspended. It effectively meant suspend democracy so that they could get the business done without the challenge of Parliament. And they took this decision. It was hugely controversial, and hate speech kind of went through the roof, and nothing in that would surprise us. But the information gives us things like hotspotting. This is not an investigation tool and can't be used as an investigation tool under the agreement, under the kind of what we have. But it's very much about understanding what hate messages say. Here's another example looking at Greta Thunberg, the fantastic young Swedish woman who's trying to save the world. And she has suffered mentions of her name in hate messages 1.82 million times. This is globally, I should say, including I should just point out the third most vociferous for that 8-day period as a location was Melbourne. But what you can see here is that she suffered hostility, and lots of it was around her, what was perceived as her mental ill health. She had Asperger's, she announced she had Asperger's syndrome, and people were attacking her because of her mental health. And what she at this point in time, this is an 8-day period where she was in New York at the UN, and you can see again 2 spikes. So the first one is where she met Barack Obama and kind of obviously people who would be hostile to him. And she goes from 100 hate messages a minute for a 16-year-old girl through to 500 hate messages a minute. And then kind of many of you remember that she was in the foyer of the UN when Donald Trump walked through. People snapped a photograph of her looking like she'd stood in something unpleasant. And clearly kind of the hostility towards her escalates massively. So these kind of these extra tools here are really helpful to us, because particularly this one, the network, the second from the right at the bottom, I'll give you an example of that. But they are really important. So I'm going to finish off, if I may, and apologies, I'm dragging on longer than I intended. I'm going to finish off in a May just with a couple of case studies. So the first one builds on that partnership. So we had a sort of fairly contemporary example of anti-Semitism. I should explain what it was first. A group of white supremacists, a group of neo-Nazis in the UK, decided they wanted to create a march to a place called Golders Green in North London, which is an area where there is a fairly high prevalence of Orthodox Jewish people. So they would be visibly recognizable as Jewish. And it's a fairly densely populated area. And these neo-Nazis decided they wanted to arrange a European march that would take place on the Sabbath and would march through Golders Green against what they called the Jewification of Europe. So we intervened. We were told about it from our civil society partners at the CST, which is a Jewish charity that supports Jewish people. So we get to talk about it. So we've got powers under UK legislation to put restrictions on marches or to ban marches if the evidence can be provided to the Home Secretary. So we started about gathering our evidence, gathering our intelligence, looking at what we could find about this, looking at kind of understanding it. And about 5 or 6 days before the event, the CST found this material on a web page owned by one of the organisers of the event. And it is hugely vile. You don't need me to explain what it is, but the caricatures of the Jewish people, the kind of reference into Auschwitz-Birkenau, the kind of reference into weeds and weed killer, Hitler references. It is, for our incitement offence, without boring you with our incitement offence says, it is almost as if they've got the points to prove and tried to fit them all onto one page. So we kind of, we took a view for the police that this was criminal. We kind of started an investigation and identified the perpetrator was this man, Joshua Burnhill Payne. He was, he posted this material. He was one of the organisers of the site. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, it was reported to us. At 11 o'clock, police officers were there taking a statement. At 2 o'clock the same day, Joshua Burnhill Payne was arrested in his home in Yeovil in the west of England, southwest of England, and he was brought back to London, interviewed and charged that night. The Attorney General stayed in his office to consider the file, which was coming to him in the evening, and authorised the charge for incitement. He was remanded in custody until he served 3.5 years, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. So one of the things that we wanted to do is reach out to the community, and here's a kind of result of an advertising campaign, which was there to alert the community to the fact that we were taking this seriously and that a man had been arrested. So we targeted Jewish people, and you can see that the result of this was a Facebook advert, and you can see that it reached 76,000 people for £130, so maybe 170, 180, I think, Australian dollars. But you can see that it reached 76,000 people. That, to put it into context, is about 1 in 4 of the UK Jewish population who got to see this. And so the number of people who responded to us and the value of us reaching out to the community in this way was obviously really important. And for me, the success of it came on the day because the police put restrictions on the march to say that it could take place, but it would take place in Whitehall in the centre of London, about 10 miles away from Golders Green. 19 neo-Nazis turned up. They were shouted down by about 300 anti-fascists across the road. So nobody got to hear the bile. They got to protest, but nobody cared other than the people who were shouting them down the other side of the police line. But for me, and this is the key part to it, there was a protest, there was a march on that day. The picture at the bottom, and basically it was everybody except the Jewish community turning out in solidarity to say that we are together in this. We will all stand up for the rights of the Jewish people. And for me, it's the most comprehensive solution to a problem, because everything was, the rights were allowed, the rights were balanced, but actually the value it gave to the Jewish community with the solidarity from everybody else in the community was more valuable than anything. And then finally, I'll just finish off with this one. In 2018, we had a series of letters that were posted by a man who ultimately came to justice and was sentenced to 12 years for kind of a series of crimes, including these. So he started off sending these infantile letters to mosques and to mosques and to Islamic sites, where he was calling himself the Muslim Slayer and saying that he was going to kill people. And it's the sort of thing that mosques and synagogues would get, and many other sites would get quite regularly. So just turn my speaker off. And he then went on to send these out. And these were very different in that they created a day where he was calling on people to attack Muslims. And he was giving them points. He was gamifying it, saying that burning down or bombing a mosque was worth 1,000 points. Verbally abusing a Muslim was worth 10 points, and gave this day of action where he called on people to do it. And this, unfortunately, was given to the media before it was given to us, and the media kind of published it. It was obviously a reasonable story. These went to members of parliament, they went to high-profile individuals, so that it isn't unreasonable that they thought it was a story worth publishing. what we were really fearful from, we took advice from a forensic psychologist who said that this man was, from what we knew of his actions, he was very unlikely to be a physical offender. But what we also knew is that we knew that we'd got a lot of people who were capable of being inspired to violence. So he is Darren Osborne, a man who killed Muslims leaving Finsbury Park Mosque in London in retaliation for the Islamist terrorist attacks that earlier that same year in 2017. And what we didn't know is whether we've got one Darren Osborne or 1,000 in the UK. So we knew that we had to kind of had a real fear that somebody would be motivated to an act of extreme violence, fueled by and motivated by the Punish a Muslim letters. So we decided through the goal group, having taken the advice of the academics and taking the advice of civil society and taking our own previous experience, we decided that our tactic would be that we would seek as little mention of Punish a Muslim Day from the 12th of March when they were in the media, because that was when they were being posted, through to the 3rd of April, which was the day. And what we wanted to do is to have virtually radio silence on it. So we agreed a stance. We asked our editors not to publish reports about it until after the day. We eventually persuaded our ministers to not speak until after the event, because their kind of natural instinct is to want to reassure communities. But we said that every time we mention this in the media, we are increasing the risk of somebody acting out violently on the 3rd of April. And we knew from experience, and we knew from the analysis that we've had, that the average attention span of the far right is very minimal. It's normally about 3 or 4 days, even after a terrorist attack. So we knew that our best chance was to play a long game, and we did that. And we did a lot of messaging through kind of secure sources, like through community links, through prevent coordinators, or the sort of counter-terrorism sort of intervention, through education, through health, through everybody we could think of who could get messages to the Muslim community of reassurance without alerting the far right to our fear. And kind of here's an example of that cluster I showed you on the dashboard. And what this measures is the kind of the mention of Punish a Muslim and the number of people who get retweeted. In the number of retweets increases the size of the cluster. So here is a woman called Pamela Galler, who many of you will know, a US commentator on the far right tendency. And she's obviously their kind of True Vision is probably one of these tiny ones down here. But you can clearly see that those two were the significant ones. This one you can kind of ignore because it was a well-known Muslim comedian who was making a joke and kind of it got retweeted thousands of times. This one's really important to us because this was, we had a stabbing of a young Somali lad who was stabbed in the leg on the Thursday before Punish Muslim Day. And he was left lying on the ground while somebody video recorded and posted it on social media while he was waiting for the ambulance and writhing in agony. And somebody took his video and retitled it and said, look, Punish a Muslim started, here's a young Muslim who's been attacked, Muslims need to take to the streets to defend themselves. And it was maliciously created. This Twitter message was from the sister of the 14-year-old Somali lad who'd said, I've told this man numerously to do this video, my family member wasn't stabbed for being a Muslim, he's just using it for political purposes. So we decided that her message was far more powerful than anything that we could say. So we did put messages out saying that it wasn't a hate crime, it wasn't a kind of a Punish Muslim attack, but her message was significantly more likely to succeed. So ourselves and our civil society partners promoted that, and here you can see the reach and kind of measure the reach that it had. So I just finished with, and this is just another example. This was a kind of historical report of an acid attack where a young Muslim lad was in the Roman Road in London, was walking down the road. A motorcycle comes by, sprays acid in his face and drives off. And again, he's writhing in agony, waiting for the ambulance to turn up. But it was actually gang related. It was 8 months earlier. But somebody takes it and publishes as a real event. And unfortunately, it's retweeted and reshared on this one on Facebook, but reshared by thousands and thousands and thousands of well-intended, particularly Muslim families who were fearful about the safety of their families and friends. And you can kind of see that this was a foreign force bad actor who was trying to create division, just the same as this one here with the Texas Lone Star purporting to be an American far right kind of voice, but is actually referencing the attack on our parliament in 2017, and saying that here's a Muslim woman who doesn't care about it while everybody else is treating the victims. The Muslim woman is walking by. It's maliciously unfair and untrue. It is one still taken from a million where she's as distressed as everybody else and is playing the same role as everybody else. But clearly this kind of somebody purporting to be from Texas, but was actually from a different part of the world and actually maliciously created, was created to stir division up between different communities in the UK. So the challenge of this becomes huge. And whilst we have kind of instances like this where our partners do acts of solidarity, when Muslim women stand in solidarity with the victims of that same terrorist attack, the reality of it is the bad news goes further and travels more. And our understanding of that relies on our technical ability, on our partnerships, and on our kind of data sets to understand the impact that's having on our society. So sorry that dragged on longer than I planned to, but hopefully my screen's ended now, and I'm hand over to you, Matteo.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was really a fascinating presentation. We have learned a lot today. It showed really the importance of, collecting hate crime and hate speech data with a whole of society approach. It shows the value of collaborations. You presented so many case studies, and also the value of solidarity across communities. It was really informative also to see the details of the collaborations, like even to the detail of the data sharing agreements that would be really useful for us. Look, I have so many questions, and it's really exciting to have you here for a little bit more time for the Q&A. But I will start to give priority to questions from our audience. So Anisa is asking, if you can expand a bit more on the mechanisms and initiatives that the UK police used to interact with diverse communities during the lockdown, and how to maintain those relationships during the lockdown.
Okay, so some of them were new. So the sort of the Chinese and Southeast Asian community is obviously hundreds of different communities. Kind of even within the Chinese community, there is a huge division geographically. Some are allied to the CCP, some who are kind of hostile to the CCP. So there isn't going to be one group who just come together as a group, and you really got to put the work in. The legwork has got to go in at a local level, at a national level. So my policing hero, John Grieve, who I mentioned earlier, was the sort of police officer who was given the job of rescuing the Met's reputation from Stephen Lawrence. And shortly after that happened, there was a series of nail bomb attacks in London by a man called David Copeland, of white supremacists, who attacked Brixton, where the black community were prevalent, and Brick Lane, where there was a strong Asian community, a Pakistani Asian community, or a South Asian community. And then a pub called the Admiral Duncan pub, which was a gay a pub where lots of gay people would sort of frequent in Soho in London. And what John kind of, that was his mantra of you can't make friends while the bullets are flying. He set up caravans in the sort of gay community. He got police officers he invited police officers who were gay, who at the time were unlikely to be out to the forces that are working it, to come and work and police the kind of community, to try and build confidence to report. And one of the things he found is that in addition to the evidence they got about the terrorist attack, is they got hundreds of people who came and reported hate crimes that were taking place from down the country. So he kind of, most of our kind of experience is built from that learning. And it really is important, that sort of issue about what we try to do, where we've got a kind of, so the easy thing is to say we've got Talmama that interacts with the Muslim community, but we know that there are big sections of the community that don't interact with Taimama. We know that there are sort of Ahmadiyya Muslims and Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and Asad Shah, an Ahmadiyya Muslim, was killed by a Sunni Muslim in Glasgow in 2016 in a sectarian murder. So clearly, if we go to the Sunni Muslim community, and we're not going to get a reach into the Ahmadiyya community. So what you've got to do is obviously first off understand your communities, about who lives in your community, who do they identify with, which ones identify locally with other kind of groups, and which ones are nationally linked. And then you've got to kind of decide who is the most susceptible, and then work out how that community needs you to act with them, and not necessarily say that here's the data sharing agreement with the CST, we'll copy it for you. Because if you're looking at a newly arrived asylum seekers from Afghanistan or from Syria, then their needs will be different, and the police can't expect the communities to adapt to the police. We've got to reach into the communities. So some of it is just literally about seizing opportunities. But when we had the terrorist attack in Manchester, at Manchester Arena, which was a horrible terrorist attack because it targeted predominantly young girls, leaving a Ariana Grande, probably said that wrong, but a pop concert, and within 24 hours, myself and the director of Taimama and some local police colleagues are standing in amongst the Muslim community and in the areas where the perpetrator came from, reassuring them and working with them to deal with the fears that they had, as well as the outrage they had. So you can't that just can't happen with a 1 a.m. phone call. It's got to be the relationship that's built. So when I stop speaking, because I can't press buttons and talk at the same time, I'll put the link in to the data sharing agreements and the True Vision site into the chat, and you can kind of see them from yourself. But they are the end result rather than the start. I just stress as well, because I have the scars to show some of the challenges. There will be groups who are ostensibly the same, and some of them will be fantastically wholesome and inclusive. There'll be others who sound exactly the same until you talk about a different subject. So there will be religious groups whose views on sexual orientation is really hostile. There will be groups from every section who have got some hostility towards somebody else. They cannot be partners. We can't. We approached, when we were looking for a Muslim group to form Taimama, because we didn't have one prior to it, and we used government money to kind of help pump around that. I must have met 40 people who wanted to offer that service. And when we talked about sexual orientation, when we talked about Ahmadiyya Muslims, and we talked about anti-Semitism, so many couldn't meet those ideals. And it's better to find out early and find other routes than to find you actually sharing a table with somebody who's espousing hatred towards others. So it's that mantra: if you can condemn all hate, you're part of the solution. If you can only condemn some, you're part of the problem. And kind of choosing your partners is a really important task.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question about something you said about hate crime being the foothill of terrorism.
Okay.
And also you mentioned that, if we look at hate speech, we can somehow do early intervention to mitigate the risk of hate crime to happen. So what data do you have to support? What evidence do you have to support the relationship between different behaviors like terrorism, hate crime, and hate speech?
So it's anecdotal as all these things are, because you can't say what happened because you did something, what you prevented. So we can obviously never say that. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner, and kind of we make decisions which impact on people's lives, and we make decisions that impact on society if we make the wrong decision. And we all know of examples where policing makes the wrong decision. For me, you could never stand there and say we prevented this, or we could have we did the right thing. what you can do is make defensible decisions, and the way to make defensible decisions is have the best expertise available to you, the best partnerships, the best data, the best analysis of what's gone on before. So in a sense, I would never claim that we make every decision that does good, and that we never miss a decision that ends up with bad things happening. What we have, and this is where I base the data to the first part of your question on, if we look retrospectively at those who go on to commit extreme violence, it is easy to spot the signs. I spent some time in Myanmar after the Rohingya genocide, and kind of when you look at the role that Facebook played in that, and the kind of the fact that the Rakhine state went from to my understanding, from 3% internet access to 95% of citizens having internet access in a 5-year period, that a benevolent government who understood the impact of what was going on Facebook, and Facebook didn't understand it, and the government didn't understand it, and Facebook didn't have a single Burmese speaker in their kind of security kind of department, so couldn't understand it if it wanted to. But you can easily see how the hostility that was playing out in local tiny communities, because it was a very disparate community, suddenly starts to play out to millions of people, and the myths that were being circulated locally suddenly become large. Just one more example, if I may. Thomas Mair, who committed one of the most heinous political crimes of my life in the UK, where he tragically murdered Jo Cox, the MP. And she was selected because she was standing up for the rights of Syrian refugees and saying that they had a right to safety and that we had a duty to protect them. And he was attacked. When you look back at Thomas Mair's behaviour, all of the indicators are there. I'm not suggesting we could have known, I'm not suggesting we could have interpreted them individually, but we received information from partners in the US within literally hours of Jo Cox's murder that were talking about his motivation, who were showing evidence of things that he'd said and things that he'd bought and partnerships that he had. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have been able to put them together, but if we could have, if we'd have known about them, and if we would have recognised that escalating hostility, and we'd have recognised the motive behind the murder that he ultimately committed. So for me, it's not to say that we could have done it, because I don't know as we could, but when you look back at what he did and his behaviour and his kind of hate speech that he made in relation to the South African apartheid regime, it is really easy to see that he was a dangerous offender waiting to offend. We just unfortunately never got it into one place until after he offended. So for me, I defy anybody to come up with a terrorist attack where there isn't some precursor in hate speech. And no, I'm not saying that every one of them wouldn't have happened without the hate speech, because there's obviously a myriad of bits of information that play a role on those individuals. But it has to be the best indicator we can have of hostility.
Thank you, Paul. Look, I would love to continue discussing the whole day, but probably the whole night for you, but probably it's not. I think it's time to wrap up, unfortunately. Okay. But it was such an illuminating session. So thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your knowledge with us. Yes.
So it's my pleasure. And all I say is, if I may, I kind of apologize for talking too long and listening not enough. I've put a couple of links in there to those documents that we talked about on the website. If anybody wants to contact me, if they haven't got my email, if they contact through the Contact Us page on True Vision, they can always get me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions outside from anybody who needs to. So thanks for your time and listening, if people still are listening, and hope the rest of the day is really good. And apologies, I'm not going to stay with you because I need sleep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Look, it was really important for us because, as we discussed before, we really need transferable knowledge. So I hope that this discussion is the beginning of a collaboration, of a longer collaboration with you to understand, the best practice and lessons learned that we can learn from the UK experience and your experience, and apply and adapt, tailor to Victoria's local context.